From the Toronto Star, I'm Rajan Mudler, and this matters. Pop quiz, hotshot. Here's a trivia question. When was the last Canadian federal election? The answer is October 2019, and while that wasn't that long ago, it definitely feels like it was. The pandemic has changed just about everything, and obviously has had an effect on the political scene in this country. Up until now, vaccine supply and rollout are the two top-of-mind issues for Canadians, but as more people get vaccinated and we start to return to normal, our political landscape is already starting to show some signs of business as usual. Susan Delacourt is an Ottawa-based columnist for The Star, where she's been covering politics on Parliament Hill for decades. She's an author and commentator who appears on many radio and television shows, and we are delighted to have her back on This Matters once again. She's here to talk about vaccines, Canadian politics, and what comes next. Susan, thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Delighted to be here in this anniversary week.
We are so happy to have you. So Susan, this is one of those things I want to talk about, the vaccine rollout and the effect it's going to be having on our politics and how this might play out in the future. But first, I really think you did a great column about the difference between the US and Canadian politicians in getting their shots. I really want to talk about this because in the US, several politicians made a big deal about getting vaccinated, whereas in Canada, politicians are very carefully waiting in line. What do you think that says about our leaders and our societies in general?
I love this distinction between Canadians and Americans, actually, although sometimes I think it goes too far. But I do think it's striking to see that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris rolled up their sleeves in public, even before the inauguration, and got the vaccine.
We just are getting some breaking news. We've got a live shot there of President-elect Joe Biden getting his COVID-19 vaccine. He and incoming First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, both doing this publicly, receiving their first doses of the COVID-19 vaccine in Delaware.
Operation Warp Speed. I also think that it's worth saying that this is great hope. I'm doing this to demonstrate that people should be prepared when it's available to take the vaccine. There's nothing to worry about. I'm looking forward to the second shot. So is Jill. She's had her shot earlier today. She loves shots, I know, but I've had so many.
Whereas Justin Trudeau, that would just not happen. That would absolutely not happen. It would not happen with Doug Ford either. You saw Ford, he's making a great show of it. He made fuss of it this week about how he will not get his hair cut. As long as there's somebody in the province who can't get their hair cut, Doug Ford will not either. I talked to a Liberal MP who's been around a long time about this, and he was quite thoughtful about it. And he said that here in Canada, we're very aware of the equalizing effect of the pandemic, that everybody can get it. You know, the first big person in Canada, first major person who had COVID tested positive was Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. And the Prime Minister himself, more than a year ago, went into isolation. And I think Canadians are super, super sensitive to the fact that nobody is better than COVID. Nobody gets in line ahead of anybody else. Whereas Americans, there does seem to be a hierarchy. You know, that they understand that wealth or status can get you vaccines ahead of anybody. Or look at the way Trump, when he tested positive too, he got the best medicines. He got helicopters and things. That would not happen with Justin Trudeau. That just would not happen.
I'm glad that you brought up Doug Ford because he also weaponized this. He basically took a shot at NDP MPP Saul Mamakwa for jumping the vaccine queue.
Not only did Orange fly in, but the member flew in too to get his vaccine. So thank you for doing that and kind of jumping the line.
And then afterward, he just chalked it up to politics. I'm curious what you think about this because was it basically, as Ford said, politics as usual? Or is this Ford trying to get back to politics as normal? What do you think?
Both things are true, I think. I'm really struck by the way vaccines have brought out, you know, I've actually put the pandemic into two stages. I think there was March to December. There's the 2020 version of the pandemic where you mostly saw, with some exceptions, politics go away. And I think that's because it was all about what citizens were doing for government, what citizens were doing themselves for the pandemic, that we're all in this together. And there was an idea that the government and the citizens were on the same side. Enter vaccines into the equation, and all of a sudden, we are back to the old conversation about what is the government doing for you. And that brings out the worst in people. You know, so 2020 was all about
ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
What you can do for your country was 2020, and what your country can do for you is 2021. That kind of stuff just feeds perfectly into politics, and you've seen all of the politicians reverting to type. I wrote a whole book on the consumerization of politics, and vaccines have turned people into consumers of government again. Where can I get my best vaccine? Where can I go shopping for it? Who's going to get me the best one? Why am I not first in line? Vaccines have almost erased all of the things that we did in 2021 to make politics a little better, in my view.
It's fascinating to look at this, and I think we can actually see this on the world stage. I mean, vaccine nationalism is something that's definitely at play right now, as well as vaccine diplomacy. Now, there's a big deal being made about the US government sending us 1.5 million doses of their vaccines, which I believe we'll be paying back once our supply catches up. But there's been a lot made about Joe Biden and this mending of the US-Canada relationship. What do you think that this sort of vaccine diplomacy played into that?
The politicians really, just like ordinary people, want it both ways. We do not want the United States to be vaccine nationalists because that hurts us. We did not want them to be personal protective equipment nationalists either. You've heard Doug Ford say, a few months before the pandemic hit, he was saying nice things about Donald Trump. And what Trump did, the attempt to fiercely guard pandemic supplies, turned Doug Ford right off Donald Trump. So we want the United States to be all multilateral and bilateral and cooperative when it comes to this stuff. Yet, in the same breath, Doug Ford has been the biggest proponent of next time a pandemic rolls around, we are not going to be unprepared. We're going to put up our borders. So we're pandemic nationalists too. Everybody has become protectionist and nationalist during this year and a bit. But we want everybody to be their better selves as long as it doesn't hurt us. Right? Very human.
I'm very curious again about Mr. Ford, because right after this news came out, it was God Bless America, and he intimated that it was his needling that helped get these doses. How did that play up in Ottawa?
We keep comparing the relationship between Doug Ford and Trudeau to what it was during the 2019 campaign, where Doug Ford was Justin Trudeau's punching bag. And that is not the case now. I think there is some exasperation with Doug Ford trying to politicize this. I interviewed Trudeau. I did an interview with him, and I tried to draw him out a bit on Doug Ford. And I think it's sort of an affectionate now, that's Doug. That's okay. What the federal Liberals like about Doug Ford, first of all, he and Chrystia Freeland turned into best buddies. I wrote about that last year. Doug Ford and Trudeau are doing events together. And what Doug Ford is not doing is helping Erin O'Toole. I was quite surprised at the Conservative convention that no Conservative premier showed up. That a year and a bit ago, this was the resistance, that Justin Trudeau's biggest Conservative headache was in the provinces. Jason Kenney, Scott Moe, Brian Pallister, Doug Ford. None of those people were to be seen at the Conservative convention, which is fascinating to me. And so I think you're not going to see Liberals poking at Doug Ford too much because they suspect, I think, if you talk to our Queen's Park folks who know Doug Ford better, that Doug Ford probably does like the federal Liberals better than he likes Erin O'Toole. He's already said he's not going to campaign with them during the election. The situation we had in the 2019 campaign where Justin Trudeau campaigned against Doug Ford will not be the situation in the next election. It's a little bit because they forged a new bond during this pandemic, but also there's a new leader and a new dynamic in the Conservative Party.
We'll be right back. I'm very curious what you think about the fact that many polls and surveys have already shown that Canadians have been unhappy with this vaccine rollout. Now, obviously, this is about to improve potentially with supply, but is there a political price that these parties are going to pay for this?
All of them, yes. Yeah, I think you saw Trudeau's numbers go down as soon as we started to hear about the lag in vaccines. And I'm hearing it, I'm sure you are anecdotally out there too, even though the federal government is not actually responsible for the rollout. They're responsible for the supply. Canadians are not all that familiar with Section 92 and 93 of the Constitution and the division of responsibilities, funnily enough. So it's just rolled all into one big ball with them. I have very educated friends who believe that Justin Trudeau is the one dictating who gets the vaccine and who doesn't. And, you see the conversation out there. The conversation on Twitter is normally ridiculous, but there is a lot of the blaming the politicians for this. And again, this is what we talked about at the outset. This is because the vaccines are bringing out the worst of us too. We actually have to rank Canadians. All of our equalizing tendencies, and everybody can get COVID, but not everybody can get a vaccine. That's the situation. And who's more equal than others in the vaccine rollout is pitting people against each other. In my own house, I've got the vaccine because I'm a designated caregiver for my mother in a retirement home. And I felt guilty about it and didn't want to tell anybody. It took me a couple of days to tell my colleagues in the Bureau. And I felt badly that I got it ahead of my own husband. This is not a normal situation for Canadians to be in, is to feel that somebody else is ahead of the queue and behind the queue. Even though we know COVID has exposed rampant inequality, we don't want to feed into it.
Perfect to the next thing. You already wrote about this. This pandemic has truly shown how uneven society is. Obviously, the recovery as well is completely uneven. So how does that play out in the future of Canadian government? I mean, you've already said a couple of times, is this about what's mine? Are Canadians going to be asking, what can you give me specifically?
I hope not. I want Canadian politics to be more 2020 than 21 on this score too. Jordan, my boss, asked me to write a year anniversary piece on COVID, and that was the piece you referred to. And I started looking back at all the ways in which, the pandemic has crowded out so many other conversations from happening. We're not talking about deficits. We're not talking even about the blockades, the Indigenous blockades that happened, but we are talking about equality. The only other major issue that has managed to elbow the pandemic off the front page was Black Lives Matter. And we're seeing the ongoing story in the military about sexism and all the isms. The pandemic has heightened our awareness and maybe our intolerance of any inequality. It looks like we want to have that conversation. We've had that conversation in many ways before in Canada, but I think it was Andrew Cuomo who said this in happier days, that COVID was the great equalizer. And it is true. You could get it whether you were a prime minister's wife or whether you were living in a long-term care home. I think that what's happened, though, is the effects of it and the inequality of it have made us aware that everything that was bad or broken is really broken during a pandemic. So there's a lot of talk about making things better for women. Women have been affected inequally. Everybody is talking about what to do about long-term care homes. I really worry that it's a lot of talk, and that would be a waste of what we've learned during the pandemic. It would be a shame. But I think everybody's having these conversations now as we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. How much will things snap back to where they were, before the pandemic hit? And I think there's a lot of resilience in Canadian politics, and some of the worst things are the most resilient too, unfortunately.
Let's go a little bit positive. I think this is one of these things that politics is about keeping score. Has anybody come out looking better out of this? I would say that in terms of just name recognition, Anita Anand is somebody who Canadians probably know who she is now, whereas I wouldn't say that at the beginning of this at all. What do you think?
Yeah, I also don't think that the Department of Public Services and Procurement was not on everybody's lips. I challenge anybody to name the last one before Anita Anand. And she's a rookie. Before October 19, she was an unelected, very accomplished professor and lawyer, but nobody had ever heard of her. I will say, I do remember when she was elected, our Bruce Campion-Smith, now the public editor, went and did a big profile of her. And I remember him coming back to the office and saying, wow, she's something. And she came into our editorial board too, just a few weeks ago, and went on for an hour and a half. She stayed and spoke to us. So yes, she's a household name now. Ottawa is filled with Liberals, as you know. Prime Minister's house is right around the corner here too. So, this is not a neighborhood where you would have heard nice things being said about Doug Ford, but a lot of people have liked the way he's performed during the pandemic. Some of it is cheesy, and I'm sure the seasoned reporters are rolling their eyes at his folksy kind of stuff. But up here in Ottawa, around my neighborhood, a lot of fondness for Doug Ford. That he's trying his best, he's doing what he can. So I think generally you've seen that Canadians are rewarding the politicians they think have been trying hard. I don't know that Trudeau has seen a huge bounce. His fates go up and down. He's a known quantity to Canadians right now. I think the jury's still out on that too. And Aaron O'Toole has not had a lucky time becoming Conservative Party leader in a pandemic. He's had some bad luck, and then he's created some bad luck too.
That's my next question right there. I mean, you just wrote about how you can't count him out. And your basic story was also pointing out just how far Mr. Trudeau and the Liberals came in one election. Now, vaccines, I think, are basically at this point right now, you can't really attack, but they've got to be preparing for soon after this. It's fascinating you brought up the fact that he's basically been abandoned by this sort of cadre of premiers that you'd figure could be a united front. But I got to think that all of them, as soon as the dust can settle, they're probably going to go after the economy, right? I would think that's the big issue, right? That's what's coming. That's the big fight, you think?
I would have said that before this past weekend. Aaron O'Toole also was at our editorial board a few weeks ago and said many interesting things there. I think the mere fact that he went to see the Toronto Star's editorial board was a sign of where he's looking for his support. I was watching on Saturday the discussions on the virtual floor of the Conservative convention and thinking, wow, Toronto is going to be a big, big deal to Conservatives. They talked about their need to regain a foothold in Toronto, that they needed to talk to Toronto audiences more. And then they went, the Conservative Party rank and file, went and voted on that resolution that climate change is not real. And again, somebody asked me, did you see fireworks going off or anything at Rideau Hall? You could hear Liberals whooping with, okay, let's have an election on climate change. Let's go. And in the House of Commons, very first day, they're back after the convention. And Conservatives get up to ask about vaccines, and the Liberals put up their environment minister to answer that climate change is real. So Liberals are having a lot of fun with this. They are now going to be doing what they can to make the next election about climate change. Aaron O'Toole at our editorial board and in subsequent interviews has been saying, we asked him flat out, what's the ballot question? And he says it's recovery, the economic recovery. If it is, I don't count him out. Conservatives have been seen generally as good stewards of the economy. And if people are getting antsy about how much we've been spending, the Conservatives have a good story to tell that, hypothetically they would have done better. I'm not sure that's true. But as you said in the opening, I've been covering politics for a lot of years, and I learned never, ever to count anybody out. It is a mistake to do that. When we went into the 2015 election, people were talking about Prime Minister Thomas Mulcair, and he came in third. So again, I think everybody's just got to be calm. Nothing has been normal in the last year, and nothing is ever really normal in politics anyway.
All right, so gotcha. I got a crystal ball.
Okay.
Like, when is the next election? When is the next federal election? You got a ballpark?
Well, I think generally, I'd sort of speak, the collective press gallery has got two scenarios in their mind, September or June. The idea has always been that the Liberals would present a budget that nobody could support and kick the country into an election. The problem is he needs the opposition parties to do that. And I'm not sure the opposition parties, especially the Conservatives after last weekend, are ready. O'Toole has to have a climate change plan out there. He needs some more time. So I lean still slightly to the idea that we're not looking at an election until fall at the earliest. But in the last few days, you have heard it around here that people think what happened at the Conservative convention is going to make Justin Trudeau even more eager to provoke the collapse of his own government and send us to the polls in June, especially with vaccines, as you asked before. Nobody wants to have an election and campaign. You can't go out and campaign with the herd if there's no herd immunity. I don't want a June election. I want a September one, or later even. I'm not in the mood for an election. I think we've had enough chaos, but I think we're going to get one this year. I just don't know when.
Well, I think most Canadians would agree with you. Susan, this has been fantastic for us. I really, really, really want to thank you for your time today.
It's been fun.
Susan Delacourt is an Ottawa-based columnist for The Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Ranjan Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.